Hi and welcome to Movie-Fi. Today I will show you a film about a detective who lives in a modernistic world where obscurity and privacy no longer exist. Warning, spoilers ahead, so look out and get movified. The movie started by showing a detective in a suit walking on the street. He read the personal information of the people he passed by just staring at them. People have the ability to access any information about people, animals, and things. While making his way to his destination, he saw a mysterious woman that caught his attention. She is the only person who has no information, a strange circumstance that he can rarely experience. He took a glance at the woman and made his way. The detective arrived at the building passing by security who accessed his information by staring at him too. The man sat at the table with a gentleman in a suit who has trouble looking for his son. The man in a suit asks the detective what happened to his son, so he showed him what happened. He was detected in ether. He was on the rooftop and suddenly he ended his life by jumping. The man grieves for the life of his son. Another woman was looking for her diamond bracelet. The detective showed her the scene where the maid of the hotel cleaned the bathroom, but the detective didn't show her what happened a minute earlier where the maid saw the bracelet and kept it. But the detective meant it to happen because the woman annoyed him and the maid just did what she did to pay her rent. Another two men were in front of the detective discussing a crime that the other man did, but at the end of their discussion, they talked about the plea agreement. The detective entered the office with a dead body lying on the floor. The detective accesses the file of the dead man named James Cray, who was shot between his eyes. Before it happened, the detective and his colleague examined how he got murdered. James arrived in his apartment, and while he was reading, the killer appeared, hacking his mind's eye, so he sees what the killer sees. The killer's point of view is now Cray's point of view. He is looking at himself. And the killer, without a second thought, killed him. The detective and his colleague were wondering how a human can hack another human. The killer has no identity, no identifying meta trail, and cannot be traced into the file, the two men concluded. However, the case matches also with a man who got shot, but the killer cannot be identified and is invisible in the file. The two men suspected that it is a woman with no identity. And the detective was reminded of a woman he saw on the street earlier that day, and he sent it to his colleague for it to examine. The detective went home and made love with his significant other, but his mind was occupied with the unidentified woman he has seen earlier. The woman he made love with saw that he is bothered with something, so they stopped and she ordered him to show what was on his mind, telling him that their relationship will end if he refuses to show it. He refused as the file can no longer be found, and the woman walks out. The detective and his colleagues are analyzing the case. While they were discussing the case, the detective told his colleague that the file he had with the unidentified girl had been erased, and he theoretically think that someone had come to his mind and erased the history he had with that woman. And when he asked for a copy from his colleague, the same thing happened to him too. The detective and his colleague were buying food down the street. The detective is studying the details of the foods while the other man is buying one. The detective, who had now a cigarette lighted on his hand, told his colleague that the people who saw the woman on the street has now a blurry memory of her as he questioned them. He drove his car home. He stopped in front of his house and an invited memory visited him. He drinks a whiskey and the same memory visited him, a boy, having fun while flying a kite. He rises from sitting and called someone. A woman named Kristen. He told her that it was the boy's birthday tomorrow, telling her that the boy would be turning 10, but the woman stopped him, telling him that he should not talk about the boy because he was already gone. But Sal, the detective, told her that he is keeping his memories with the boy alive. In the middle of her call, a man appeared telling Sal that he can't call Kristen every hour, and Sal was boiling with anger, telling him that he should understand because it's his and Kristen's son after all, and the man walked out. Kristen asks Sal if he is drunk, but he lied, and when Kristen wants to see his record 10 minutes ago, Sal ended the call. Sal has no company and continued drinking, but another case appeared, so he hurried and left home. Two lifeless women were lying in bed and the same scenario happened to them too. They were hacked. A responder and Sal were watching the witness record, and Sal and the responder figured out that the killer is still in the building. They prepared their guns, they inspect the place, but suddenly, the responder got shot and died. Sal runs toward the killer, but it is nowhere to be found, so he runs away to the street, still trying to look for the murderer. He reaches for the subway, but when he was on his way down to the stairs, he is seeing it differently from what it is. He searched around, pointing his gun and studying all the people, but suddenly he got hit by a train and was thrown away, and a dancing woman appeared in his mind's eye. The next day, the detectives were studying the case of the lesbian couple who had been shot, but the detectives still can't figure out the killer. The killer is not detected and they have a hard time capturing the killer because the killer erases herself from the other people's memories and files. The gentlemen were still analyzing how to capture the killer. But Sal had realized something and he let his colleague see it too. The killer changes what Sal sees like an optical illusion. Sal thinks of making himself as bait. He changed his name and personal information. He lived in his new life like a normal person. He invites a woman to his home, but as part of the plan, he will look guilty, and for the fear that her fiancé will ask to see what he did when she was away, he will call for a hacker to change or erase some of his histories. Sal was puffing his cigarette and someone messaged him named Anon. They will meet that night, but Sal has everything planned. He waited for her and unexpectedly the woman they are looking for arrived. When Sal set his eyes on her, she told him not to look at her. Sal, who changed his name to Saul, told her that he wanted to get away from an affair and the woman told her to go into his apartment. They arrived at Saul's apartment. The woman had herself a drink and she examined Saul without knowing that behind the walls, a detective is studying her. Saul is explaining to her that he wants the history of him and the woman he made love with to be completely gone, and the woman replaces the scenes on what Saul would choose. Saul asks her why she has no data and name or she can use an alias, but she told him that she doesn't want to exist with anyone. But when she was about to leave, Saul asked her what happened if she can't be erased in other people's memories, and she told him that there is only one way for it, and she pulled out her gun and made Saul turn around and she left. Saul ran outside and his colleague called him telling him that he still has no record of the woman. On the next day, Sal and his colleagues, Charles, were talking about what had happened. They reached their meeting place with other detectives and other tech specialists. They hacked the woman by watching her point of view. They saw a scene where a painting was brought by a man, but they changed the history showing that it was only discovered. However, she logs out that disabled the detectives to hack her. Sal was sleeping and he had dreamt of the woman that they were looking for, naked. The detective and the tech specialist were watching the woman all night and day. They can only see what the woman sees and nothing more. The woman walked towards the window and the detectives were relieved because they can now know the location of the woman, but unexpectedly, the signal was lost. And Sal asked the tech specialist if the woman sees them and he said no. Later that day, Sal and Charles were given the news that the guy who bought the paintings they saw on the woman's mind was dead, with the same case, the killer's point of view. They discussed the possible ways how to capture the killer. But the only way they can think of is to use Sal again as bait. Sal was back to being Saul, a normal guy and not a detective. Saul messages Anon again as part of the secret plan to replace his history. Saul was buying drugs and he asked Anon to erase that scene. Anon asks Saul to put a line of drugs on the table and they consume it together. As part of the plan, Saul asked a lot of questions to know who really Anon is. Anon was hesitant to answer Saul's question, but, in the end, she tells her story. She was 18 when she started to erase her identity, but as soon as Saul slowly got her trust, she pointed a gun at Saul asking him if he really is a man in a relationship, because it looks like he is not, but surprisingly, he kissed Saul. The two ended up making love, and when Anon was about to leave, she took a glimpse of Saul's mind and found out that he was a detective. She hurried and killed the man next door who is Saul's colleague. Anon called Saul mentioning his real name and identity. And she told him not to look for her or he'll be dead. Sal was full of sorrow for letting Anon escape and for letting her kill his friend. He went home, alone in his house. He poured himself a whiskey when Anon messages him, and out of the blue, his sight changed. He was hacked by Anon. Sal can see a man who is beating him and a dog that is attacking him. He resists and he went back to his senses. He saw himself in his empty apartment. Anon was not done yet. He made an illusion that hundreds of rats were in Sal's apartment and he made Sal remember his son's death. Sal was wide awake the whole night and he welcomes the morning sitting on his couch and puffing a cigarette. He fed himself with good memories by thinking of his son, but when he is looking at the file, they were slowly blurring and were deleted. Sal rises from sitting and faces a mirror. He called Kristen for a copy of their son's face, but Kristen's memories of their son were gone too. He walks out to his door, but he saw fire all over the hallway. He pulled out his gun and shoot everywhere. His next door neighbor called him and he went back to his sense. However, when he opened the elevator, Anon was not yet done playing his mind. While he drove himself to his workplace, Anon played his mind's eye that causes him a car accident. Sal met up with Charles to share what had happened to him, and in the middle of their conversation, a man walks in front of them telling them that they are arresting Sal for killing his next-door neighbor. They investigated Sal and decided that he will be arrested, locking him inside his house for further investigation of the case. There was a man outside his apartment watching him, and the tech specialist was watching him too. He lay on his bed and closes his eyes, but he rises, still his eyes closed, and made his way outside. When he reaches security, he knocked him down. Sal made his way to Anon's place. He searches the place while his gun is pointed in the direction he was going. He heard Anon telling him to put down his gun. Anon explained to him the real scene that proves to her that she did not kill the people who had been murdered and is done by someone. The police arrived and Sal went outside to explain to Charles the real situation. He told him that the hacker had been hacked, but Charles told him that he is covering up Anon because they made love. The next day, Sal was back to a house arrest. Sal was watching the security outside his apartment when Anon messaged him. She told him that she needs to see him, so she hacked the tech specialist control on watching Sal's action, and she hacked the securities outside Sal's apartment. Sal was preparing his gun when his sight got blurry and suddenly, he got shot. The tech specialist, who was the murderer after all, pulled Anon, who just arrived in the apartment. The tech specialist watches the point of view of Sal, but he forgot to do the same to Anon. Anon asked him who he was, and she found out that she was an anonymous proxy, the last one in chains, and he kept her safe. He told Anon that the detectives hired him to lead her to them, but he led them away. The tech specialist was fascinated with the algorithm, and he told Anon that he knows how she felt about wanting to disappear. When the tech specialist was about to shoot Sal, Anon stopped him and told him to only hack him, making it look like Sal never saw them. And when the tech specialist pointed the gun for the second time to Sal, Sal pulled the trigger and shoot him first. The tech specialist pulled Anon outside, but Sal got up and he followed them. He refuses to look, so he kept his sight to the wall and he pulled the trigger, shooting the tech specialist, and when he sighted his eyes to him, he shoots again. Anon walks out like nothing happened, and Sal didn't stop her. Sal was remembering his son when someone speaks to him. He looks where the voice came from and saw Anon. Sal asks him why she still wants to hide and who she was. She told him that he needs to have an algorithm to put her entire life back together. The story ended where Anon walks away, erasing herself from Sal's memories. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to get more stories. Thanks for watching.